All right. Good evening. I've been asked to introduce Ole Scheeren, which I'm looking forward to do. I'm looking forward to hearing what he's got to say. Ole first crossed my path and Robert Miles' path in 1997. Funnily enough, Rem had been an examiner for the 2 years before that and seen some of the work done in the school. We were working in China at the time, which I'm sure was quite ominous for Ole's future. And Ole came and worked with us. He was very impressive at the level of his ideas and the different ways of seeing the city. So I think when he worked with us in the school, he was a great contributor, and in a way he gave a hint of what he might be doing in the future. What seemed completely unlikely was that the future would let him do what he wanted to do in the future. He came to the AA in 97, as I said. He started working at OMA in 95. He told us when he came that he wasn't working at OMA. He managed to keep that going for a year and a half. But then we found out that he was curating the Cities on the Move exhibition at the Hayward Gallery, so it was pretty hard to hide the fact that he was working for OMA while he was with us. That didn't stop him. He did very well with us. He designed a project called City Hall, for which he won the silver medal with Henry Rotter, who's here as well. And he's one of the few people I've met who's actually made me some money, because I also won £500 when he did that. As the Prada projects began to emerge, I could sense Ole's touch in the background. So I remember coming to Rem's lecture and he was talking about the Prada projects, and I could just tell that Ole was in the room. And I think his way of thinking was there. And then China. China I've been to 3 times. I was there last year. And I think it was 2 years ago, someone sent me Time magazine. And I wondered why anybody would send me Time magazine. And it was because Ole was in Time magazine. So I sent him an email saying it was fantastic to see his name in Time magazine. So I thought that was great. Then saw the CCTV building, and I thought that was great. But last year when I went to China, I thought, Jesus Christ, I mean, how do you do this thing here? So I'd like to introduce Ole, and I'm desperate to know how he's managing to survive in China. Ole.
Thank you, Carlos. It's obviously not entirely true what Carlos said, because first I was always working next to the studies, and they didn't notice for a year and a half. And secondly, I wasn't probably exactly the good student that it seems, because obviously failed to finish the year that we were supposed to, and extended for another year because we didn't get the presentation together because there was too much work on the side. So it wasn't all that smooth and glamorous as it seems. Nonetheless, I'm somehow really happy to be here again for the first time, kind of since I left. I'm even a bit nervous, I think more nervous than for any of the other lectures that I've given in the past 2 years. And it's really sort of a strange moment of being back. What I want to talk about today is mostly China, and I will obviously present some of the projects that we're working on there. And I will talk about the projects and about a few other things, but maybe also after the long talking, there can be more talking in terms of discussing things a bit. But before talking about China, I quickly want to show what happened last summer, 2004, when we opened Prada Los Angeles on Rodeo Drive, the second epicenter store in the US. And what promised to be the most natural artificial environment we wanted to address with openness, architectural openness, a store without a storefront, with a transition between outside and inside, and this idea of blurring public and private space that we had started in New York with a performance space inside the store. At night, simply a panel would rise from the ground and hermetically seal the entire store. In the end, though, it was less pretty women that came investigating the things. We had actually tried to partly hide in the basement. And we had probably also not anticipated how difficult it would be to contain the crowds that gathered outside. The screaming was so loud that the architectural concept was nearly failing, and you couldn't have any normal conversation during the opening day inside. We almost had to raise the wall again to protect the inside and make any normal conversation possible. In the end, it was maybe more important to realize that the architecture was simply just a footnote and that it would simply disappear behind things that really mattered. China. China is a land with a fairly complex and also ambivalent past. Many problems and issues still remain today, but it's also a country in the process of an enormously radical transformation and a speed of change, but with a declared interest and commitment to adjustment and change. And maybe what in some ways is most interesting for me about it is that it is not a change in terms of simply shedding a past for a more glorious future, maybe in a way in which most other socialist, formerly socialist or communist countries have done. And there is many good or rather bad examples of that in Europe. But a country that is generating a hybrid between partly seemingly or obviously contradictory positions of state power and market economy. And it is obviously a situation that is both bears incredible dangers but also an enormous potential for things to happen there. It's a system or maybe rather an experiment that is hard to evaluate and very hard to predict what it will actually do. And I think all our common senses or means of assessment or tools of evaluation are partly or actually completely useless in this context. And it's more a continuous relearning and readjustment in the work and while being there that I think characterizes what's really happening. And I think that this is also the most important aspect of our work in China. It's maybe important to remember history. Both dynasties and leaders of the revolution and after this implied a culture of radical changes, each one implying or imposing a completely different legacy. And I think this might partly have led to a culture or psychology that is capable of dealing with radically different conditions and challenges without an aspect that maybe, especially I think the Europeans are very good in a sense of regret about anything of the past and a sense of sentimentality about the past. And it has been really both extremely interesting and in some ways also difficult to learn and understand that what we think is right or wrong is not necessarily the same way that people feel over there. So it's also about being very careful to judge too quickly what you're looking at. At the same time, there's obviously still a strong sense of political coherence. And while I was negotiating the contract for the CCTV project in 2002, there was the 13th Congress of the Communist Party, and obviously the whole city stood in a ban of these events. Streets were mostly blocked for convoys of cars rushing past. And at the same time, while you're there, you're inevitably also involved in such things. The signing of our contract in December 2002 sort of assumed in itself almost a political state event. But obviously there's also something happening with an enormous dynamics, a new generation emerging, people occupying, let's say, directly below the visible leadership, both in the political but also in the administrative areas. There's a generation of in their mid-30s to mid-40s that actually have started to run the country, actually the entire country. You know, the director of the Planning Commission in Beijing is not any older than that. People at CCTV that we're working with are no older than that. And it's a radically different situation to working elsewhere in the world, to working in the US, where you usually encounter double that age in any serious position, and maybe also here. So it is this generation that has started to kind of take charge and has taken charge with a very specific agenda, I think, and clearly not an agenda declared in a manifesto, but maybe no less strong in terms of advocating and implying and actually developing change. And the 2008 Olympics in Beijing are certainly, to some extent, have somewhat become a deadline or a kind of milestone in this process. And also the CCTV project, the moment we were invited to the competition early 2002, was clearly in that light, in the context of this process of change, and maybe also in the context of a symbolization of this change and of those ambitions. China is growing enormously, and now the population alone outnumbers continental Europe already, and this is obviously it has impact on everything you do. As the fastest growing economy, the process of modernization implies, in some ways, maybe the only context in which architecture still seems to have a chance in a very different sense than everywhere else, where here it maybe very directly contributes to the growth and to the reshaping of a reality in a much more radical way than other conditions confront us with. And it obviously also has massive implications for the actual making of architecture. It's maybe good to quickly remember what Rem did with the Harvard students a whole number of years ago, but again investigating the conditions of the Chinese architecture production, which still haven't changed that dramatically in most cases, at least not in 2002 when we started. I think the last 3 years have actually already implied a rather dramatic change. China had only about 1/10 of the architects of anywhere else in the world that were producing 5 to 10 times the amount of square meters designed for ultimately 1/10 of the design fee. And now we're not only looking at that, but obviously being in the middle of it, both in the fees and in the speed and in everything that it entails. While with the publication of SMLXL, it was a kind of obvious milestone for the office. A lot of projects had been thought, but very little had been built. Since SMLXL, and you can see basically in gray, the gray squares are the number of projects done, and red is what is actually constructed until 95, that is, end of 95. And since then, a single project in China has meant to triple the 25 years of architecture production of the entire office. CCTV is 600,000 square meters large in total, the project, and it obviously has meant an enormous shift also for what is happening inside our office. At the center of Beijing is the Grand Palace, or the Forbidden City as the Westerners call it. Around it, within the second ring road, is the old inner city structure of historic courtyard houses, the hutong, that basically made up Beijing's city fabric for, you could literally say, thousands of years in a very stable and permanent environment. In 1949, things changed, and Mao declared smash the old and create the new. And after basically 1 decade of building factories and staging the industrialization of the country, the first kind of really architectural manifestation since the historic age were the 10 great projects in 58 and 59, all about 100,000 square meters large, commissioned, designed and built and completed within a single year, less than 12 months. It is very obvious that at that point expertise and architecture were closely related to Russia. After that, the city started to grow rather rapidly in a concentric development around the Forbidden City. Ring roads were built, and the 80s brought a large boom of housing development as a follow-up to the 70s baby boom and huge population explosion. So this is how this city started to look around this area of Hutong. And while the third ring road was only completed about 12 years ago, 11 years ago, 93, 94, today the fourth and fifth ring road are complete. The sixth ring road is to 80% finished and in use, and the seventh ring road is already under planning. So basically within a single decade, this city literally exploded outwards, and that has obviously meant dramatic transformations for the city and for the life in the city. But how to design a building in this context where the old city is increasingly disappearance, where political coherence is still so strong, where the new city increasingly looks like this, the ring roads and intersections that surround the center, where the recent, still quite recent architectural past of China, this is the Ministry for Transportation, completed now 7 years ago, had a very, and it was actually the mayor of Beijing who for a while insisted in every building sprouting a Chinese style roof. And you can still see a lot of examples of that obviously now start to assume actually a kind of incredible strength and beauty, maybe even in this context. But where this was at only 7 years ago, the declared future still of China, and where the foreigners, with their first big statement when Paul Andreu arrived to design, win the competition for the Grand Theater right next to Tiananmen Square, basically gave this poached egg, as they say, swimming in a large water basin. Obviously, this project has undergone, since Charles de Gaulle and other things, a whole series of loops that one could probably lecture about entirely another time. CCTV is currently located at the intersection of Chang'an Avenue, which is the main east-west axis going through the city. In the center, the Forbidden City. This is the second ring road and the third ring road. It's currently located in the west at the intersection of Third Ring Road and Chang'an Avenue, and will basically mirror across the Forbidden City to the east into the new central business district. The site itself is of an almost unimaginable scale, 20 hectares in the middle of a city. And the context is one that, again, is hard to imagine in a tabula rasa that has simply taken away everything that existed on the site. There were car and motorcycle factories that had gone down and that were taken away about 2 years ago. And the only sense and certainty you had of the future of this place was this rendering given by the city planners of Beijing of the dream of how the CBD should look like more or less by the Olympics, so in 3 to 4 years. So it was a very, it's a very difficult context to design in. On one hand, there is this enormous city with this enormous strength and power, with dimensions that both in terms of street and the buildings are beyond any scale that you've seen before. Tiananmen Square is also still the largest open urban space in the world. And then there was this vision for a future, and the vision was obviously only given by a dream of 300 skyscrapers emerging in this area. And the moment we came, these are the two towers of the World Trade Center. Here behind is the Kerry Center, and then Jingguang Tower is here. These were basically the only towers that existed the moment that we started working on this competition. And all we knew that there would be skyscrapers all over. It was obviously a very interesting moment for the office to think about a skyscraper. Since Delirious New York and everything that had meant, we actually realized that OMA had never done not only a skyscraper, but probably not even a vertical building. Everything kind of ended up magically flat. And you wonder how that works with that beginning. But then it was obviously a moment where the question was acute if the skyscraper was still what it was 100 years earlier, when about 30 years earlier, or 25 years earlier, REM actually described its potential of its birth in New York and Manhattan, when it was a typology dedicated to urban density, to a density of different programs, to specific programs, and ultimately an incubator for metropolitan life. But obviously what is happening today, most central business districts have absolutely no such density as Manhattan. Instead, they isolate all towers in a kind of surroundings of green. The only purpose of the skyscraper is to multiply an ultimately valuable piece of land as often as possible vertically to maximize profits. And all is left is this needle-like piece with absolutely no relation to the city, with no connection to the ground. So at the bottom, a socle or plinth tries to compensate for its inertness, and at the top, there's either a flower style or modernist composition decoration that tries to compensate for the ultimate lack of identity. It is also about 2 years ago that for the first time in history, Asia actually has more skyscrapers than the West. And while the skyscraper was born in the US, Asia clearly adopted this typology as the symbol of the growth of its economic power and its modernization. And it's perversely enough exactly happening in the past 20 years when precisely the West, who had initially created this typology, had stopped thinking or writing about not only this typology, but even the city almost in large, to provide possible starting points for a further development of this. And we felt that it was obviously about time to see if there was no other possibilities and no other sense of designing a structure that would not be all about height, but about re-engaging space and city space, and maybe also a programmatic and content-related configuration that would start to draft up a new possibility. CCTV is already today one of the largest media organizations in the world, with 14 self-produced TV channels. When the new building will be complete, CCTV will be able to broadcast more than 250 channels from this single structure. Television in China is relatively young, actually exactly in '58, together with the 10 great projects. The first broadcast was made. And it obviously has been since, as the national and state broadcaster, also the main funnel and bottleneck for information both coming into the country or leaving the country. And it is clearly the tool that censors still information. But at the same time, there has obviously also been a process more and more dissolving these rigid boundaries and starting to open up. For example, in '98, when for the first time a high-level political meeting was live and unedited broadcast, and therefore obviously allowing for anything to be said or anything to be heard at any moment. And it was in the last 2 years that major changes also happened in the Chinese TV industry, of now opening up and for foreign companies and actually allowing for all kinds of collaborations that necessarily imply a vast breaking up or bypassing the actual control of information. If you look at CCTV as a state broadcaster, like all public TV companies, also CCTV receives subsidies from the state. But already in the year 2000, while the subsidies were about 30 million yuan, CCTV made so much money with their advertising that the actual taxes they paid were 80 million yuan. So many times bigger than the subsidies, which ultimately obviously shows that there's a complete also economic independence of this organization. And their advertising revenue the last year would have been enough to pay for the entire construction project in one single go. The program for the building is enormously large, as I said, 600,000 square meters. But when we started the competition, already the given elements for the design, 1/4 of this whole program consists of public facilities, and this is something entirely new in the situation. The current CCTV site is entirely gated and hermetically sealed, basically, from the public. So this project was also clearly announcing a context of an interest of opening up and making itself more accountable to the public, and this was obviously an important part of the design. We proposed, instead of combining all elements, to actually split the program in 2 parts and create 2 main structures. The main building, CCTV, which accumulates and summons all activities of television making in a single building, and the second building, TVCC, the Television Cultural Center, that would be the entirely public building and contain a 1,500-seat theater and all kinds of other public facilities. And the split we obviously proposed in order to guarantee at any point in time the perfect functioning of both entities, because it is still rather unpredictable how quickly security concerns will either heighten or lessen. And obviously, even in the wake of something like September 11, any security concern of a high-rise structure has now to be viewed under a different angle. So we proposed 2 buildings to guarantee that the public building could always be public, while the main building could oscillate according to need between a secured or also an open structure. The most important step for CCTV was to propose a loop of interconnected activities where offices, administration, news and broadcasting, program production, services and research and training centers, so the entire process and all the elements involved in the actual television making would be combined in one single structure. The idea obviously was to declare something like solidarity rather than isolation, and propose a structure that would allow for a much more concrete and direct collaboration than opposition between the departments. In the end, a system where the brains would know what the hands are doing, and it might seem more obvious to propose that than it really is. We already had noticed while working for Universal Studios in the second half of the 90s that most media companies are in a complete disconnect of their departments. Obviously, the world of the digital contributes more and more to a possible physical isolation of the different pieces. And in the end, an organization is not only no longer capable to represent itself, but also to operate or think as a single body. If you would build a TV station in any part of the world entirely governed by the market economy, you would be forced to actually separate. You would put the studios, essentially huge empty volumes, into the cheapest and industrial parts of town. The business guys would go into the CBD in a tower, the creative guys into wherever. Once it was Farrington, then it was Old Street, then so they would move. And obviously, it is only this current hybrid of state power and market economy that unleashes enough capital to undertake a project like this, but also enough maybe belief to at the same time generate such a density of possibilities. The building resembles much more an organism than really a speculative envelope. It's completely specific. It is filled with technical rooms everywhere with specific functions, and that all coexist in an interdependence. And it is maybe not only this, but also the 10,000 permanent staff that continuously occupy the building and the several thousand visitors every day that propose to think of the structure maybe much more as a collective than simply a building. And maybe also this idea of the collective is one that in a context, or that has a specific resonance obviously with a socialist context, and maybe could possibly declare a kind of architectural alternative to a political inevitability that apparently the market and the so-called democracy has become. The building is basically threaded up, if you want, by this loop, as we call it, a circulation system for both staff and public visitors that are kind of readmitted to the building to actually circulate through and not only experience CCTV as a media organization, but also visit the studio part, this kind of central city of large volumes with director control rooms and actors' lounges, the main broadcast control center in which the 250 channels will be checked and broadcast, new studios in one of the towers, offices and administration, and ultimately within the overhang at a cantilever of 70 meters in 180 meters height, a public viewing deck onto the city. Obviously, these numbers imply entirely different needs for the organization of a building. We have often enough maybe talked about it, but now we had to really design a space that would be able to channel 15,000 people daily into and out of a building. So the main lobby exists on 3 levels with a direct connection on B3 to the subway station. The main ground level and in between layers connecting to the underground parking around the building. The lobby itself split up basically in a system of fingers that separates permanent workers and staff from visitors with different security concerns or the tourists that can actually move along the loop. The geometry of the building, while the inside is entirely based on an orthogonal system, both towers slope 6 degrees in 2 directions and are then joined at the bottom by the base and at the top by the overhang. Inside the towers, the cores remain completely vertical and contain an elevator system that probably is the most complex ever designed. About 99 elevators serve the building in a system that uses double-deck elevators, so 2 cabins traveling in a single shaft to save space and shuttle people up to the top floors, because it is obviously quite unusual that an actually large building sits on top of a smaller building like a tower. The structure for the building, while maybe a more traditional approach would have been to split the building again into its different divisions, into isolated sections of big mega frames that then would be connected in themselves. We felt it was maybe much more appropriate or interesting to also here think of the structure in a similar way like the programmatic contents, as a continuous piece, as a loop of continuous forces that would surround the building. We proposed to we covered the building in a triangulated mesh of a steel structure of 10 by 10 meters. So the outer surfaces would actually act like a tube folded in space, and the surfaces themselves would become the main carrier and distributor of the stresses in the building. Obviously, this complex geometry has by no means an even occurrence of these stresses. What you can see in red are the zones that have to work much harder than others. And while again, a maybe more traditional approach would have been to then dimension each member differently and according to the stress, we simply added members where more stresses occurred and eliminated them where less forces would occur inside the structure. The result is something rather irrational looking and unstable looking, but obviously representing in the end the perfectly stable condition of the building. This gave our engineers a lot to think and also us to worry about. And in the end, China, nonetheless, it is probably one of the most complex structures ever engineered to date. And China was simply not capable with their traditional means to assess and approve this structure. And maybe many other countries would have been in a very similar situation. But it is maybe also part of this enormous dedication of that country to the idea of making things happen and to not stop at their own limits, that a whole new process was thought up to deal with this project. And while so an expert panel of the 13 most senior structural engineers of China was put in place, and while this is something, expert panels do exist in China, but usually it's a group of people that at the end of a design process simply looks at the design and checks if it's all okay. It was here a really intense collaboration over a whole year. Several meetings were held with these engineers that were the people that had actually written the Chinese code, all the codes that this project broke entirely by all means, to define the design criteria for the project and assess its viability. And almost exactly a year ago, January 2004, we received, this was the final meeting in Beijing, we received approval for the project. Beijing is earthquake zone and almost as severe as Los Angeles, one of the most severe places to build. So the analysis of the project had to be absolutely detailed and intense. And while there were more positive moments where the building seemed to nod yes and support it, there were obviously also more worrying moments, down to almost belly dancing like situations that could occur. Ultimately, the structure was designed in a way in which the performance of basically every single of the 10,078 steel members is known. It's kind of probably by complete accident, but nonetheless interesting that the number of steel members that composes the building is the exact equivalent to the number of people that occupies the building. But it was maybe that and a really intimate knowledge of all the parameters that would shape the design that probably outdo anything ever analyzed about a building before. Down to the point that the system defined by Arup of not only building up the two towers, but then ultimately connecting this big cantilever in the air was defined to the degree that this connection could only be made around 6 a.m. and at no other time of the day, when the night was at its longest before the sun would rise and both towers would have cooled down to the maximum to limit the differential stresses inside the structure. Rory, who was actually the engineer on the previous picture, is also here today, and we have kind of spent the last years in actually a sort of intimate embrace on this design. His wife is also here, but I don't know what she's saying. And it has really been, in a way, an incredible experience and also an incredible experiment of generating a complete hybrid between architecture and structure, in which both things at this point are completely inseparable and really compose if you want, the true nature of the project. For anyone who's ever been in Beijing, most likely what you've seen is this. 70 to 80% of the time the air is not clear and there's not sunshine, but it's actually milky white. It's a kind of Beijing blur in the air. It is partly because of the approaching desert, so they say, but also the many construction sites in the city. But it's a condition that is kind of serious, because it ultimately makes almost all architecture look incredibly bad, and especially any glass high-rise building look incredibly bad. So it's something you can't ignore when you design a building there. And at the same time, obviously, what could happen is also extremely crisp light and sunshine. And so how could your building possibly perform in both those conditions? The only buildings that we thought actually survived in both were the ones that weren't completed yet, the ones covered by a nylon mesh and a steel structure, kind of green solid monsters that inhabit the city. And we thought our building could be very similar to this in the end. And what we propose is something based on the glazing that we first developed now for the Seattle Library, a kind of laminated mesh inside the glazing that in this case really assimilates a lot of the properties of these green nylon textures, that from the outside obviously is almost solid, but from the inside completely transparent and lets the city basically shine through. The structure itself, we express on the facade, it's basically like a dissecting mesh, almost like a bound figure that structures the big shape into smaller units. And also here, these units perform as structurally intact and very tight elements that for all the movement tolerances simply use the lines of the structure to take up and absorb these issues. But the facade itself, that in the way it relates to the structure, where sometimes the shape itself appears, sometimes it disappears, and only this network remains in the sky. The building is so large that any direct expression of its internal functions on the facade is almost impossible. So we propose to add to the building an iconography on the facades that would be partly digital, partly physical, from embossed metal to embedded LEDs in the glazing, that would allow the building to communicate to the city, but also CCTV to communicate to the city beyond the level of architecture. But obviously it's also the architecture itself that declares an iconographic status beyond a sense of height, but maybe through very different properties in the context of other tall structures. But it is obviously not only CCTV, it is actually two buildings. It is also TVCC, and the way in which the two buildings relate to each other that are very much about the project. And TVCC we called the weak building. It's in a way a building that has absolutely no concept and no clue. After we had done CCTV and it was such a strong shape and it was so complete in itself, we felt you couldn't do another piece that was complete. So we basically just left it at that. We put some of the program volumes on top of each other, looked for a long time at different ways and how that could work, and in the end just put an envelope over it and said, it's finished. And it has never changed since. Obviously, when you look at the scale of the second building, it is still a size that completely outdoes or summons almost everything we've designed before. And it is always easy to forget the second building next to the main building, but I think also a real mistake. It has a 1,500-seat theater, which is basically as large as the concert hall in Porto. In it. It has a hotel that is bigger than Astor Place, a 5-star hotel. And so many things. It has exhibition rooms, it has a ballroom, it has digital cinemas, press release halls, etc., etc. So this building in itself maybe we forget too often to talk about. We were looking for a structure to accommodate all these different volumes. In the end, decided to pixelate most of the units and create a hotel facade where each room would be an articulated volume inside this envelope. Each room itself as a complete, basically a shoebox extruded from the inside, overlooking both CCTV and Beijing. The rooms form an atrium of more than 100 meters height inside the tall tower, and the lobby is half swimming pool, half check-in desk at the bottom, on an elevated level 15 meters above the ground, with all its different facilities. The main element maybe in the building is the theater with 1,500 seats. And while normal theaters of this scale tend to have a large parterre, the largest number of seats attached to the ground, and then add 1 to 3 balconies to increase the number of seats, but ultimately start to separate and segregate the audience in different pieces. We thought it could be really exciting to do nothing but a single balcony that would summon all the seats, and where basically everybody would sit on the single floating sail. we disconnected the sail from the ground, which all of a sudden did something very crucial for this theater. Now when you enter, this is the foyer, you enter actually at the level of the stage. So the whole ground floor, foyer, stage become inseparable. The whole ground floor is an entirely plain surface that can be animated and basically played by a whole series of stage scenery mechanisms. But it also allows a television company to actually use the theater for television making. The ground is now completely flat and accessible for TV cameras to move around, because obviously in this theater there will not only be traditional performances, but also television broadcasting of those. But it also meant that completely different arrangements for stage and audience were possible. So basically a huge promenade where you could drive basically or march into the theater on one end, through the entire space and out at the back. This is a view of the main auditorium and this balcony, and you can see here this open ground usable not only for more traditional shows, but also for all kinds of further experimental performances. This is a view of the ballroom and the ground floor, where you can see this kind of loose accumulation of all these different volumes, big recording studios for any type of music, the theater, supporting functions, AV rooms, digital cinemas, the ballroom here underneath, and a box with a press release hall and exhibition spaces. In a way, the ground itself sort of almost disintegrating and integrating itself into a texture that covers the entire site, the ground of CCTV, a pattern of Piranesi that we simply overlaid and then started to, that kind of starts to connect all four blocks of the site. The site essentially intersected by two public roads, the main part with CCTV building, the northern part with TVCC, a service building that contains an energy center that basically serves both buildings and keeps them free of most of the technical obligations, and a whole part in the east that we could keep clear as an extension of the central green axis of the CBD. This ground, a surface that could be interpreted in many different ways, both as gardens or parks, but also as partly functions and built program to essentially declare the entire ground a public terrain where outdoor filming could happen, tours for visitors, but also events both for the people and for the politics. Beijing is growing incredibly fast. There's currently 6,000 construction sites in the city. There's 9,298 projects that are underway, and far more than 100 million square meters that are being built. This expansion obviously implies an enormous destruction of what is there. And in some ways, our project obviously is part of this process of modernization and also part of the process of destruction of the city. So we actually, while we met the city planners during the work on CCTV, proposed to collaborate on a project on preservation of the city. And basically did that with ammo out of our own ambition to possibly not only think about the renewal, but also about the maintaining of the city at the same time. We obviously looked at the history of that, and it's clear that France and probably England were the two that invented preservation and ultimately institutionalized it. But it was also important to look at what was actually being preserved in the world today, and how there had been a movement basically from ancient monuments down to concentration camps and highways, but that with that also the scale of the actual elements of preservation had dramatically changed. Recently, even the proposal was made by an American to declare a site of cultural heritage, the landing spot of Apollo on the moon, and declare it for forever untouchable. But I think what is interesting, despite all these developments on it, that although things that are being that are declared worth preserving are becoming younger and younger, there is still this magical gap of at least 25 to 30 years that doesn't seem to close. And once you think about it, it obviously preservation has always been very much determined by a rather sentimental way of looking at things. The moment that things are simply old enough, nobody contests that they're worth preserving. If it's really old, everybody agrees. If it's reasonably old, then there's a bit more discussion. But obviously the point where it stops is exactly the generation of your parents that you hate most. So everything 20, 25 years ago is the worst and should definitely be taken down. The result of that obviously is that the moment that things are identified as being worth preserving, most of them have already been destroyed, and maybe the best examples have been destroyed. So we proposed in this context of Beijing and of China, where also here the latest things that were identified was Tiananmen Square and the surrounding buildings, the 10 great projects, to not hang on to this sentimental, rather European tradition, but maybe rethink preservation in systems that would not only be related to age and time, but maybe rather to typologies, to declare both public buildings, but also apartment buildings of all kind of decades of the city equally valid, but to obviously go further and look at infrastructure and even places of events, not only at a point in time when everything was too late, but maybe as a more systematic approach to this subject. We obviously also made more provocative proposals as how to approach preservation on the scale of an urban map, where Beijing develops in these concentric circles to say if you would simply keep a wedge of this, you would have something from the oldest inside to the newest outside, or simply an almost random banding of things that would then give you old and new right next to each other. I want to show a project that we did, a competition that we did and lost autumn last year. And it's a project that is maybe important precisely in this context of preservation, because it's the project for the China National Museum, which is located here on Tiananmen Square. And you can obviously not imagine historically more almost burdened location than this. You have Tiananmen Square, the Forbidden City, Mao's mausoleum, and the Great People's Hall on the west side of it. The building itself is one of the 10 great projects and is an architecture that is both so overwhelmingly strong and maybe possibly weak that it is incredibly difficult actually to design for this, and not only an architectural but obviously also a generally historical question for how to interact or intervene in a structure like this. The competition brief proposed to extend the building to the east. The museum had acquired a strip of land to the east, and basically the doubling of the program was supposed to happen in an extension to the existing building. When you look at the existing building, though, you realize that it is almost entirely empty. It is basically just a thin shell of corridors surrounding two huge courtyards. And the building is like that because when it was designed urbanistically, it had to hold the mass of the Great People's Hall on the other side of Tiananmen Square. So it was, if you want, artificially inflated beyond its actual programmatic content to inscribe itself in a correct urbanistic context. So what we proposed was to not add anything to the new, to the old outside, but to simply pour the program into the center of the building, declare the existing building a mold into which we would simply sink all the new requirements and simply densify the existing structure. So it was like building a new building in the empty center of the old. And this is a Chinese representation of Chinese history, this kind of spiral that starts basically in endless time backwards and sort of approaches the now. And it's quite a really intriguing and beautiful way of looking at history. So we wanted to use that and actually sort of unrolled it in the perimeter of the existing structure, so that again this mold would hold potentially a complete chronology of the Chinese history, and then built into it a system of rooms, cells and spaces that would allow for both flexibility within, but ultimately drop a completely connected tissue of spaces that would both allow you to circulate through the linear history around them, but also shortcut into the different rooms and compartments inside. Each room could assume totally different characters, from traditional gallery spaces to almost aquarium-like conditions where you would just in a transparent tube really be channeled through almost solid exhibits of pottery and other artifacts. And where these rooms themselves would be suspended inside the building and underneath contain a large public plaza. Obviously, the system would allow for a continuous recurating of the structure and of the exhibits, and also explore and exploit the changing relationships between the two parts that the collection is made up of. One is historic China, and the other is the history of the revolution, so essentially the past 50 years that, interestingly enough, have both about the same quantity that they occupy inside the space. The only kind of element of true newness that we proposed was an interface between the old and the new, a media wall inside the building that would be the most flexible and completely changeable piece of information, and could contain both graphic but also text-based things that would ultimately negotiate between the two different exhibits in the old and in the new building, and that would also be the only thing visible from the outside of the building. So to leave this existing structure entirely intact and not confronted directly with a new architectural object right next to it. We obviously lost the competition. And it was kind of interesting also that moment to realize, because we had obviously been, there is an extremely vivid debate in China about architecture. There's a website on which many things are published and discussed, our project as well as many others. It's a community of discussing people so strong that it probably outnumbers any number of architecture students in a country like this one, as large as they are. And it's also a debate that really takes very strong positions. And one of the things we were obviously also accused for was to come in and design such a imposing and visible structure such as CCTV. And we were actually quite interested in making a point that working there was not at all only about this, and maybe we were chosen for for this in a specific context, in the context of the CBD, this area that had been declared as the terrain for complete newness and experimentation within the city, but that architecture could as well assume a very different position, for example, in the context of this museum of Tiananmen Square. But then to see that in the end, it was maybe still the bigger gesture that was wanted, and what won in the first place were the rather large interventions. What has now been selected in the end is a actually strange hybrid that has parts of our proposal, so also an infill of the courtyards, but still a new object, sort of announcing progress and intervention on the back. And it was obviously maybe really a piece of almost contextual work that we wanted to make in this proximity, and that I think in itself maybe also should be part of a discussion of how to build in a city like this. The last project that I want to show is the design for a bookstore in Beijing. This is Chang'an Avenue. Here's the museum that we just talked about in Tiananmen Square. And this is the theater by Paul Andreu. And the bookstore located on Xidan Square is not too far away down the road. If you move along Chang'an Avenue, we've seen this building before. It's really a kind of series of large monumental volumes that each one in themselves manifest a presence in a particular way. And the existing, there is an existing bookstore, which is this building, again, only completed 5 years ago. It's a bookstore with 50,000 square meters floor area, and it obviously, and the competition actually asked to extend this building and add another 50,000 square meters to have a bookstore of 100,000 square meters. When we designed Prada, we obviously thought that was a big store with 2,000 square meters. And then it was, again, almost implausible at the beginning to think that you could design a bookstore that would be 2.5 times the size of the Seattle Public Library. But once, obviously, you go there and you enter this store, it's not only full of people, but it's actually full of people reading. Everywhere people sit, stand, and read. And it's a building that is used by up to 50,000 people a day. And it's a building that really operates as much as a library as a bookstore. Although sales are huge, the actual consumption of reading, or the activity of reading in there, is so strong that it all of a sudden rendered, again, this whole proposition probably entirely plausible and not completely absurd. And to also see that a building like this with existing 50,000 square meters would be already fully used to its maximum. The competition asked to extend the existing building and basically join both into one with a new facade. What we proposed was to address the public, but also handle the large quantities of book readers and buyers, to take both buildings into a single volume and basically unite them through an internal space, through a void, a public plaza that we would cut through both structures and use as a central distribution system into the then 4 separate quadrants of the building. This would also structure the building from the outside, define large openings to both Chang'an Avenue and the big square to the west of the building. And basically provide elements in the context and scale of its surroundings. The plan itself, here you can see this public cross that was accessed mainly from 2 sides. implied a complete reorganization of the interior. This is the part of the existing building that we completely restructured. We actually put all offices into a new sliver on the east of the building. But also this idea of bringing the public inside, we wanted to kind of turn the whole structure inside out and then actually bring the books to the outside of the building. So to think of a facade that could be something like a translucent bookshelf in which the activity of people reading and buying would actually start to animate the building and ultimately animate the facade as a kind of pixelated surface on the scale of the city. After we had won the competition in the first meeting, and after we had signed the contract for the project, in the first meeting the client came and said that actually everything had changed. That they didn't own the building by themselves, but that there were two other parties, a steel company and a bank, that are co-owners of the building, and that they had simply decided that they weren't very interested in this transformation and that absolutely nothing could change about the existing building. So what we had proposed here, a complete restructuring, actually rather looked like this. In reality, an existing space of the bank that couldn't be touched, existing lobbies and entrances that all had to be maintained. Plus the client declared that they had actually picked our project but never really liked the idea that this cross-shaped space would completely separate four parts of the building that would no longer be physically connected to each other and therefore make it much more difficult to merchandise the space. So the dilemma was reasonably big because at the same time the project had to continue because also this has to be completed before 2008, before the Olympics. So the question was really how could we invent a new design? We had basically 2 weeks for this. How could we invent a new design that would, this is if you want the existing bookstore, it's on 4 floors, that completely respects the integrity of the old structure, not do anything to it, but at the same time change everything about it. By the way, also the client had cut the budget in exactly half in the same go. So also there, that required a new simplicity of thinking for what we would do. And the idea then was to completely change the concept and say if what we did before was to isolate or separate different parts, maybe we could simply go and create something like a connector that you would put next to the old and without physically changing it, imply a condition that would completely transform the old. The new building is a system of ramps that connects to each horizontal floor plate of the old building, so that now all of a sudden the entire building is a single spiral and you continuously move from new into old, from old into new to circulate through the building. And that also as a principle that would actually allow these 50,000 people a day to not be confined to escalators for vertical movement, but actually to circulate the whole building. This is the ground floor plan in which the ramping starts and you move up and into the old building, and you can see here the remaining bank sections back up into the new, circulate around, and ultimately end on a kind of mezzanine level with a big multifunction hall looking back into the system. Each one of the ramps, again, imparts an idea maybe first invented with Jussieu, partly built in Seattle, but they're really as a book container, and here now as a system that while it would encompass a completely handicapped accessible ramping typology, would start to spiral up the building in completely different configurations and characters for each department and section of the sales area. the in-between renderings just submitted by a Chinese company, but also the ground floor that initially was this precise box that came down, but with the new condition, with a complete impossibility to alter any of the existing needs, no longer capable of actually either maintaining or articulating the entrance conditions. So we started to modify and basically articulate the ground floor as a really sort of active plane that would give each entrance and each function a specific articulation, but that would also allow us. The competition proposal had built out the existing structure 9 meters to the south to include a subway station and add this new facade related to program. But so a way to basically re-include all these elements, and in a way a geometry that all of a sudden also started to inscribe itself surprisingly well really in this complex context of other structures and the square around it. In a reversal of the maybe classical typology of the heavy box above and the glass floor below, we actually it will be a steel envelope partly perforated but essentially solid that forms the base condition, and the box itself we still develop in these translucent glass blocks that we've started to prototype and develop as a basically masonry wall, like bricks made out of glass, 1 meter wide by 50 centimeters tall, that will compose the facade of the building. 2004 was a difficult year. It started really with a phone call that I received, I think 4:30 a.m., sleeping in the hotel, of a very upset colleague from our PR department that told me I immediately had to call someone from the London Times because he was about to write an article that would announce the death of our project. I made this call, and despite a 1 hour long conversation, the next day the London Times published an article that was the beginning of an avalanche of rumors and news for an entire year that continuously declared the project over and dead. While the Chinese Prime Minister was even quoted in this article and afterwards apparently was extremely upset about the manipulation that Western media would undertake of the realities. Despite all doubts, the work continued. The client reassured us that everything kept going, so we kept working full speed ahead for another year on the project. But obviously the doubts were also part of a new regime, part of a change in leadership in China's government, and of a new consciousness maybe and carefulness about the big spending. And some of you might know that this has affected many projects there, Herzog de Meuron Stadium, that at some point was in preparations to be redesigned completely for half the money by a Chinese company, but then agreed to reduce cost and go ahead. And obviously also our project was part of this reconsideration, and very rightfully so, and it is something that, as difficult maybe as it has been for us to work during this year of almost weekly news that everything was over, it was maybe also a very legitimate moment for China to reconsider what they were doing, and to reconsider if all the plans and projects made before were still valid. But it was obviously also enormously exciting later to find out different. It was obviously connected not only to the projects, but also to a general discussion of what it meant that foreigners were working in China. And maybe one of the really important aspects of the project and of our work on the project was that by no means it was really a foreign work in China, but that the people that worked on the project in the office were not only hardly at all Dutch, but only half non-Chinese, that it was a real effort from our side in a collaboration that continues until today, that it was the first time ever that we had made it part of our contract negotiations that our Chinese partner office, ICADI, that worked with us from the very beginning of the project, would send 13 of their staff to live and work with us for a year in Rotterdam while we were doing schematic design and design development, and that now we have sent or brought 10 people from our side to live and work in China with them continuously on the project, and to really make this effort as a kind of bi-directional educational effort where both we have learned a lot from them about maybe what it means to work there, but they maybe also have learned from us why we design the way we design, and that there is no intention to simply export an architecture, finish a design, dump it, maybe send one poor guy over there that has to struggle to try to follow, but essentially not give a shit anymore about what's happening to the project. And it has really been this on many levels that has, and until today, is part of the effort of the entire project, and maybe of the important parts of the entire project. And it is also realizing that this is a single drawing set at the client's office and our site office in Beijing, that things are at a scale that maybe you can no longer handle them by non-involvement, but only through a complete commitment, and really sort of this is the view from our office. So it is on the other side is this vast empty site, and at the same time it's basically still completely embedded in the local texture of local life, and that maybe all of this is part of such an effort. And that also it is an effort not only by us, but it's really an effort by us together with Over Arab that have also provided or really collaborated to an intensity that I think has never existed before on the project, and our Chinese partners, that without any one of them, none of what I showed today would really exist. But also actually of the person that you see next to me there, Dong Mei, who is basically project managing large parts of everything we are doing, and sort of we've almost become like Siamese twins in China, and so it's always two different brains thinking at the same time, and by no means a kind of singular interpretation or view on things. And obviously the whole process of translation has a whole number of implications. On one hand, all of a sudden you have much more time to think, so you become much more careful of what you say, because after every sentence there's a pause because someone translates for you. And my Chinese is obviously still nowhere, although I wish that will change before the end of this job. But that also within this process there's a lot of transformations happening, and this was end of last year. This billboard was all over the CBD and the streets, and obviously if you read the English meaning of it, it's a strange hybrid between a socialist call for going back on the streets and a really capitalist idea of, but obviously the Chinese meaning is a completely different one. It rather means that if you live here, you're something like a world citizen. But it's really that in some ways maybe characterizes all the subtleties and transformations and that happen, and that being careful and not too fast is rather important. After all, September last year, the groundbreaking happened for the project, and the client assured us that it would be a tiny, intimate event to which we basically shouldn't appear. It was a tiny, intimate event. Only a few of their staff were allowed to come. But obviously, we felt slightly different and overwhelmed by the moment. It was an incredibly cheerful moment for the team, but maybe not only cheerful, but also as scary, although support was much larger than partly anticipated first. If you really realize what you have drawn, this is the footprint of CCTV. Here you see the base and the big plinth that occupies the ground. It's basically 300 by 300 meters that have started to excavate into the ground. The hole is growing with such an incredible speed that has obviously completely outdone all our predictions for the timing of it. We are 2 months ahead now of schedule. And as you see the hole grow, you really realize what you're about to do there. And it takes you 20 minutes to walk from one end to the other through this hole. And when you then stand in the middle of it, and this red thing is a person and there's another person, you actually start to realize what the hell you're doing there. Thank you. This is, by the way, the title of the lecture. I almost can't get rid of it because I think it's whatever you talk about in this context, it's the most appropriate thing I can ever think of. It's a sign. It's a Chinese slogan, basically. It's a sign that we found in the factories on the site the first day we arrived. And obviously, adjust during development and develop during adjustment is something that I think is really what has characterized and keeps on characterizing our work best.
Ole, thank you very much. I'm glad you're surviving it all. I'm very impressed by what you've shown. I wonder if anybody has any questions for Ole that they'd like to ask. People are very shy here, I'm afraid.
Yeah, in China, there's a lot more questions after.
Well, I'll ask you a question. I said at the beginning, I've been to Beijing 3 times, last year. I did go with the impression that whether you were on or off, I remember emailing you, I didn't know whether to believe you or the press and so on. But one of the things that seemed extraordinary was that the pace that you described made one wonder whether in Beijing the things that you've tried to do with architecture would actually be appreciated. How do you feel about that? Because it just seemed that the growing of square meters was sort of a paramount reason. What the square meters looked like or how they were devised seemed to be something that might be swallowed up. So it's quite interesting. On your site, there's a curved building on the corner of your site. The second time I went to Beijing, this was the only tower in Beijing, and it was a big thing. And one of the students actually his parents had an apartment there, and then now it doesn't exist. It's just yet another tower. So do you think that people will actually appreciate some of the things that you've been trying to do in the architecture there?
I think first of all, things are changing with such radical speed that it's quite dangerous to actually ever give a complete assessment at any point in time, or that it's maybe even almost impossible to do that. While a lot of what was or is built might have seemed extremely undifferentiated a few years ago. Actually, if you go now through the city, there is already a whole array of buildings, and many of them actually not designed by foreigners but by Chinese architects, that are completely different and that are completely contemporary and that are certainly as good architecture as anywhere else in the world. So I think the process of transformation there is actually one that I would say already partly contradicts maybe what you're asking for. At the same time, the work on CCTV, it's obviously a project that is so big that it has a certain amount of attention, maybe beyond others. But maybe it also has that because hopefully or possibly it can play a role on a different level, also in maybe liberating kind of culture of architecture with a certain leap forward that proposes, again, a hybrid between engineering and architecture that maybe in the same way hasn't existed before, and that it can also actually encourage local practice there to go beyond some of the discussions that were maybe still held a few years ago. And this is obviously, this is a hope, yeah, and this is a hope combined with what I talked about before, with a sort of intense collaboration with people there, and also an intense exchange with people there that hopefully will be meaningful in this context. Yeah.
What I found very fascinating is what I found quite fascinating about is the contradiction between the radical speed of development in Beijing you're talking about and the complexity of the building you designed, which in a way demands for in a way long-term planning, and all through the construction process seems to take the same speed as development in general. There seems to be quite a lot of discussion whether this building is going to be valid when it's going to be finished. So just interested in how that has influenced the decision-making process of during the design process and decision-making process of the client.
It's obviously to a large extent our own insanity or partner-ivity that we proposed something that complex in that kind of time frame. But maybe also not, because again, it's anyway, I would say already the scale of the building and of the whole undertaking has implied the need for a completely different methodology of working. The team was 60 architects strong for schematic design and design development, and 110 engineers. Obviously to coordinate then a team across 3 continents like that, but also to design a building that not only is that big, but that also, partly because of its scale and partly because of its nature, a media organization is probably the most radically and fastest changing business that you could imagine. It will obviously also be a building that before it's completely finished at the top, the parts at the bottom will already have been converted. Yeah? So I think also that requires a totally different method of working, but also it's a scale that you can no longer think in terms of detailing, for example. It's a scale that you maybe rather have to think in terms of master planning, where it's a lot more about strategies of how to control certain things, but no longer about how to really fix them, because they are not fixed. And where all of a sudden you have to decide what you don't do and not anymore what you do. Yeah? And that's, I think, really quite different to any of the other things you usually would be engaged in. These are all parts that obviously have again meant simply a continuous learning and relearning of what we are doing. And there was in a way no complete expertise you can draw on. We obviously had the help also of partly more senior and professional offices or people, but you realize that when you look for someone who has actually run a project team of 60 people, you don't find anyone. When you look for someone who has built a building of that scale, you can't find anyone. And obviously, if you look for someone who's done it in China, you certainly can't find anyone. So there is very little givens that you can really fall back onto. And so a lot of both courageous but also careful processing you have to do. And I mean, it's, yeah, I think it is partly as crazy as it sounds, but it would also be a complete mistake to declare this a kind of naive experiment, because obviously it wasn't. And the team of consultants and architects that has worked on it has obviously done so with an enormous awareness of what we were doing. And from the design of the structure, all the processes that it went through, and obviously also an enormous scrutiny that was applied to it, both from outside and inside the design team, I think has really meant that it is far beyond a kind of just let's go and do it idea.
How much do you think people in Beijing care about a landmark, an architectural landmark such as CCTV?
How much do Londoners care about it?
How much do they care, the actual people in Beijing?
How much do Londoners care about it?
No. How much do people in Beijing?
Yeah, no, I'm asking you.
Oh, I don't know. It's for you to answer, I think.
It's obviously, it's maybe not for me to answer. Maybe it would be for others to answer that. It's obviously, it's a good question. But again, I think it is not so much about the role of the building simply as a landmark, but really as a moment of time in a process of transformation that it maybe partly symbolizes, but much more than that also really embraces or maybe fuels or is simply part of. And I think that this is maybe the much more important aspect of the building, yeah, than the question of being a landmark or not.
If you can hear me, we might care about it, but it's not actually in our country, so to speak. It's not in Europe, it's not in the West, it's in Beijing. So it's their building, and so how much is it? I'm trying to find out if it is, in a sense, we're putting our architecture into Beijing as opposed to what they might perhaps want. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. Again, I think I've tried to explain that we are very aware of the aspect of putting something somewhere that you only have limited knowledge of or limited involvement in. Although some of us live there permanently now for a year, or some of us have been going there for 13 years. But it's really, it has been and are the continued efforts also of working with the Chinese on it, and in a way not doing this whole thing by ourselves, but actually together. But at the same time, obviously, as an architect, you will always be at the point that at some moment you take a decision for putting something out there that represents or stands for a number of things, and that some people will like and some people won't.
Your split main project, your graduation project, the innovative reading of that project has a kind of funny relationship with the CCTV. But what I'm particularly curious about is how the kind of education you received here in the AA found a way in a kind of
Yeah, that's a question for Carlos.
how the education found a way in a kind of unique position which OMA takes in the profession.
Well, I think the most interesting thing about school or studying was that the most important thing about it was to immediately get rid of it after you finished it. Yeah? I've changed schools 3 times, partly because I was almost kicked out, and partly because I almost never finished, and for other reasons. But in some ways, I think that what remains most important is to remain quite critical to your own environment, to question what you do, and as you say, there might be a funny resonance between the completely decentralized structure that we proposed, Henrik and I, for the graduation, compared to this completely centralized piece in Beijing. But maybe that's exactly the point, that it's not that once you've given an answer, that answer is forever valid, and that all the truths, might they be well taught, are partly valid and partly not. Yeah, and I think you have to keep going in many ways.
There's someone there, I think.
Okay. I mean, I thought it was really interesting, I mean, to hear about the ways the program was being put together, and for instance, the idea is that by the time the top of the building is actually complete, the bottom will actually start to be refurbished. And I guess there would be many other aspects one could discuss about how this project might evolve over time. I mean, given that this is the case, I mean, why, in a way, not capitalize on this as far as the form of the building is concerned, and why actually give the architecture such a distinct shape? I mean, it might there not be a way of having, you know, say, what Rand talks about as a kind of Byzantine aesthetic or mosaic-like aesthetics in his junk space?
I think it's a very good question. First of all, I think there's two parts to it. On one hand, the building obviously consists of more stable and more unstable parts. Yeah? There is a number of things in the building that are very specific and very fixed, and a whole other number of things that is extremely flexible or changeable, that obviously tries to anticipate or at least allow for a certain amount of transformation and change to go on over time. The other question, why give it a shape and not remain entirely shapeless? You could obviously take that position. At the same time, I think that it might also be a very interesting question to ask if precisely the moment that everything gets shapeless, either smooth and wobbly, or also simply disconnected because technology allows for further and further disconnect of things, but also the moment that reality production is more and more debased of place, to actually think of the manifestation of such production in a very concrete and specific way, and in some ways almost to create a kind of in big words, a kind of place of accountability of something, that you actually know where it is happening, and that it also gives it a shape and gives it a place. For example, in a city, I think is maybe an equally valid thought for it. And again, I believe that it is maybe also a kind of new or an increasing importance or a role that architecture could play to not completely surrender to the shapeless, while it obviously has to both acknowledge and partly include it, but that again does not necessarily have, for example, formal consequences for it, I think.
I would like to ask a question about when you start to this project. have you really questioned about this kind of condition in China? You show the picture about CBD. It's a very radical condition, and your project makes this situation more radical. So, do you think about another way to deal with this kind of condition?
Yeah, again, it's obviously undeniable that, as I said also in the talk, that the project is part of the radical transformation, that it is part of, therefore, erasure of existing structures. Again, I think what it proposes is to recreate something maybe of a very of a shifted character, but maybe not necessarily of completely different ambitions, in the way in that it tries to propose a kind of collective and connected structure and texture inside the building. That obviously also the idea and hope for the ground of the entire site and the liberation of parts of the site to be available again is part of that. But at the same time, it is obviously also, it is in the context of the CBD, and it is something that a single project could never entirely reverse, and also has to operate within a framework that at that point obviously wasn't entirely defined by us. But again, our later work and the fact that we are looking at preservation or at other parts of the city, we are obviously trying to think about it and trying to address it. Yeah?
Okay, Ole, I think you've done us proud. We're very glad to have you back. Next time you come, we'll ask you whether you did do it 10 times faster and for a tenth of the fee. But we'll wait and see. Thank you very much.
Thank you.